Hello, I'm Annette Jones and I'm here to talk about the loss cycle or the change curve. A lot of organisations look at changes and events and use this process model to kind of make sense of what's happening. As a counsellor and therapist, I tend to use it to process a huge event, something like infidelity. So when we think about a traumatic event, really the things that we think about are an impact to self-esteem, and that's about feelings, and the time it takes to process that event. And this model here helps us think about it in terms of what's happening and when. And typically a traumatic event can take up to 3 years to process. And people often think, wow, there's no hope for me then, I've got ages to go. And it isn't really about a sequential thing. It's about processing things in a way that is fit for you. And typically there are 5 stages to a traumatic event, and the first being denial, which is why me? How has this happened? No, this can't be the truth. No, I've imagined it. They couldn't do that to me. To coming down to anger, why me? How has this happened? Absolute rage and despair that something like this has been foisted upon you. And the phases, really, you can go back to being in denial and still feeling angry all at the same time. It's like you can wake up for a split second thinking, this hasn't happened, and then the reality of that sinks in. And then the bargaining phase, which is, how can I get out of this? What sense can I make of this for myself? What, I suppose, sometimes distractions can I put in place? How can I retrieve this situation? How can I make the best of this situation? Sometimes you can be a bit delusional. And again, they're interchangeable. Sometimes there can be hope in all 3 of these phases, where you can look back. Perhaps, parts of the jigsaw are fragmented, it's difficult to understand how it's occurred. And so there's lots of, incomplete pictures. But really the reality ultimately settles in, which is this kind of depression phase. And I don't really like using the word depression. I use it to kind of emphasise a stage, but depression can be about feeling really low, it can be having the blues, it can be a clinical diagnosis. It means different things to different people, so one size doesn't fit all. So depression is about you knowing how you feel, and I suppose the difference between how you did feel to how you're feeling now, and what those feelings are, and their impacts on you. So if you're feeling like you can't get out of bed, if you're feeling that you really can't hold a conversation, that you're crying all the time, if these kind of things are very different for you, they're not typical behaviours or exhibits of emotion. So the depression stage is where you're really taking in what's happened and you're not running from it. Whereas the earlier phases or, you're kicking out, somebody's done something, it's not fair, how did this occur for me? What can I do to get away from it? This position is really about you've got it and it's in you and you know it. And moving from that, I'm taking a big deep sigh because that's a real tough time. But from really accepting it and taking it in, you can move to this phase which is about, it has happened. This has happened to me. And I'm going to roll with that and I'm going to experience that. I'm not going to flower it up anymore. I'm just going to kind of marry up that thinking and that feeling. And acceptance is also about what is it that I want to do about knowing this about myself, because a lot of these phases are about looking back and knowing and understanding where you've been. So it's accepting a reality. And once you've kind of got, I suppose, on firmer ground, it's then thinking about what you might want to do about that. And out of that, I suppose, comes a snippet of hope. The last phase is renewal, but there's a huge curve, a learning curve here. And it's really about who am I now? What is it I want for myself now? What changes might I put in place? If your life has become very small, you might be thinking about new beginnings and changes within yourself, ultimately resulting in a kind of new you or a changed you, a more wise you, a more reflective you, where the trauma is part of you now. And I've drawn it in terms of kind of emotional stages, but equally these stages can be mirrored by lots and lots of physical changes and impacts. And it's worth us noting that, in the early days of a traumatic event, the body itself is in shock and suffers hugely. The mind's wonderful and it will protect you, and so your body may experience more of the shock than your mind is prepared to acknowledge. So feeling really sick, having a tummy upset, bad headaches, aches and pains, dizziness, memory loss, forgetfulness. These are just some of the kind of more physical aspects that hit people that have had a shock. And so what I always think about alongside the kind of emotional progression is about taking care of yourself physically. And that's about really acknowledging the pain and going to see your GP and thinking about that chemical imbalance in those early stages where your GP may recommend some medication. Psychologically, you might not be up for that, but it's worth thinking about that chemical imbalance in the early days to give yourself a real fighting chance. And you know yourself best, so you follow what your own intellect and emotion tells you. So I think the thing to think about is that with any change, there are phases, both in the body and in the mind, that we go through. They may not happen in sync, and they certainly may not be sequential. You can go from being in acceptance right the way back to denial if something happens that triggers you back there. And that's okay, because you've made sense of this before, and you can hold on to yourself, you're getting more resilient as that happens. So that's relapse is not a bad thing. It's a kind of affirming thing where you kind of know you've dug yourself out of that hole before. So the cycles alongside the bodily impacts are really important to note. And through this whole process, really, it's really worth just reflecting the amount of change that you are going through, and just giving yourself a real pat on the back for allowing yourself to go through this process and not fight it.